So shall we start?
Yes.
All right. We, Ahmet Erdem Anatolian High School, are going to argue that people landed on the moon. First, we are going to mention about the political side of the case, then prove the reality of the photos taken and videos recorded by showing them and answering the questions which argue that they are lies. After that, we'll show the materials taken from the moon. At last, we'll support our argument by touching upon other topics about the moon landing.
Okay, so I'm Yeşim and this is Ece. We are going to talk about the political side of the moon landing. So first of all, why did NASA decide to land on the moon? In the early 60s, NASA made a project called the Mercury Project. It was the very first US project about space. After that, they began to work on a program called Apollo. They were doing it for political reasons. When the World War II ended, a new war started. It was a Cold War between the USA and Soviet Union. They were in a competition called the space race. Both nations were trying to become the superior one on the technological innovations. This space race lasted for 18 years, from 1957 till 1975. It began on the 4th of October 1957, when Soviet Union blasted off the Sputnik 1. And also the first alive being which was sent to the space was a dog named Laika. But Soviet Union didn't have the technology to bring the dog back, so the dog died in the space. In 1960, two dogs named Belka and Strelka was sent to the space. In 1960, two dogs named Belka and Strelka was sent to the space, and they also got back. In those years, America was still working on monkeys before sending any humans to the space. Soviet Union sent a rocket with no humans in it to the moon before, but America was the first one to send a human to the moon. Neil Armstrong was the first person to land on the moon. This actually made America show their power and their superiority over Soviet Union. Approximately 500 million people watched it live.
If they didn't go to the moon, how can they deceive the Soviet Union or other countries that watched the rocket? Or why didn't these countries find out USA's secret? Why would they take the risk of being disgraced in the Cold War to the Soviet Union by taking fake videos? Isn't this against the goal of politics? From European Space Agency, ESA, a space engineer Rainer Kriskin is saying that the Soviet Union had all kinds of technical possibility. If the NASA's moonshot was fake, the Soviet Union would find out this and show it to the whole world. From Oxford University, Dr. David Grimes calculated the life of a conspiracy theory of hiding the truth from public statistically. In a nutshell, it has a mathematical formula that shows how many years can the governments hide the truth. Let's see. Let's say that there's a government secret of a project, and if 2,521 people work in this project, it finds out in 5 years. Do you believe that you can 2,521 people forever? In short, there should be a few people in the secret to hide the truth for a long time. Then, let's decrease the number. If there are 1,000 people in a secret project, you can hide this from public for 10 years. But if there are 125 people, you can hide this for 100 years. However, 411,000 people joined in NASA's moonshot project. If NASA lied to the people, it would come out in 3 years, 8 months.
And also, there's a question everyone's asking. Why NASA hasn't sent anyone to the moon in the last 40 years? So first of all, they don't need to. They actually proved their superiority and they are working on very bigger projects now, such as the Mars Exploration Program. And also, NASA didn't find much in the moon. There was nothing to explore. And again, also, it was so expensive. They were working on other projects, and to be able to work on the other projects, they had to abnegate some other projects, and they abnegated the moon project. And also, I'm going to give you a quote from JFK. He said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." And this actually shows us that America wanted to do the hard stuff. They wanted to show their power to the world, and that's why they landed on the moon. And now the other one.
Hey, I'm Sarah. Now I will be talking about the videos and the photos that has taken in the moon, and you can give us some claims and we will give you answers. Claim 1, you can say that the lights on the moon are out of order because there is only one light source in space and it's the sun. But on the surface, the shadows of the objects point in different directions. And this shows that there are many sources of light, just like in a TV studio. Our answer is this. The only light on the moon's surface is not the sun. The sunlight is reflected from the moon's surface and forms a light source from different angles. The Earth in the sky in all Apollo's scans in a powerful light source that illuminates the moon's surface. The world illuminates the moon's surface more strongly than the moon appears in the Earth. Claim 2 that you can say, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's photographic machines must be melted or frozen if they have actually landed on the moon's surface. And the important points that the temperature must be between minus 170 and plus 150 centigrade degrees. Our answer is, if frost means thing related to the water, it is not possible because there is no water to make moisture on the surface of the moon. If the machines themselves are meant, it doesn't make sense to mention the risk of metal, fiber, and glass being frozen already in solid state. That is frozen. The temperature on the moon's surface is high, but not high enough to erode the rigs of the cameras. Access to photographic films of the heat provided by heat-resistant optical coating and points. Now I will be telling my last claim. You can say that space is filled with stars, as a child of every 10 years might say. So why do not these stars appear in the photographs taken on the moon? Our answer is astronauts took photographs of white objects shining by bright light. Under such conditions, photographers took photographs with a small lens aperture with fast exposure time. This makes it impossible to display faded objects in the dark background, just like the stars do. Thanks. Now my friend will give you some claims.
Hey, I'm Onur. I'm Onur from Ahmet Aril Montoli High School. I'm going to tell you some claims and answers. Claim 1, in order to attract astronaut descent and rise again, a third person with a camera in his hand must be found. Our answer is Neil Armstrong. Small steps were taken by camera attack outside Eagles Landing model LAM. On the surface of the moon, Armstrong's first steps are actually the images taken by astronauts Buzz Aldrin as he goes down the marine. The cameras left on the moon can easily view the lunar model's picture. Claim 2. If the Apollo astronauts really went to the moon, then they had to be cooked by deadly space radiation, radiation, which was a great arch. The place where the our answer is the place where the Earth's magnetic field is constructed by the sun rays. One Allen arches will be dangerous for people who have been there for a few years. They even passed through astronauts within a few hours and were not exposed to more radiation from medical X-ray. And there is one more claim that is, we're asking why the flag was moving. The flags are moving due to vibration during astronauts flag taking. It's seen that the flag does not move in the video after the vibration on the second time is flipped.
Hello, I am Ismail. I will talk about you the materials which taken from the moon and which left it on the moon. Okay. Between 1969 and 1972, people landed on the moon 6 times. 12 people traveled around the moon and they collected 380 kilogram moon rocks. These rocks are special through their chemical nature and their geometry, so that they are different from Earth rocks and meteors. These rocks carrying prints of crashing in the airless area, and they are 200 million older than the oldest rock in the Earth. These rocks were examined by scientists, and all of them accepted that they aren't from this world. There is no scientist claim opposite. Another subject mirrors. On 20th of July 1969, Apollo 11 and its crew landed on the moon. Famously, Commander Neil Armstrong planted an American flag on the moon's surface. Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, carried with him Lunar Laser Ranging Reflector Array (LRR). They are still on there. It has 100 meters. With the powerful lasers, we can know the distance between Earth and Moon. There are many people who have tried that. For example, a group of astronomers in New Mexico. You can search that in the site of New site.
Hello, my name is Fatih, and I'll talk about the satellites. So, the satellites which sent to the moon, like Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, have taken high-resolution pictures to show the point of loading. Vehicles which stage there, even footprints of astronauts. They aren't only taken by USA satellites, like Selene satellite of Japanese, Smart 1 satellite of European Union, and Chandrayaan-1 of India, and Cheni 2 of China. The satellites of impractical countries. Since 2000s, the Prince of Attila program has been investigated by LROC space vehicle. So you can see the new photos and look to Prince in 2012. The flags which planted and still stand in the Apollo missions photos have been published. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa, and I'm going to talk about the cast in Apollo 11. For Apollo 11, the first moon landing is a story that belongs to many, not just few random famous. It belongs to the seamstress who put together 22 layers of fabric for each spacesuit, to the engineers who created a spatial heat shield to protect the capsule during its fiery re-entry. It belongs to the flight directors, camera designers, software experts, suit testers, telescope crew, aerospace technicians, photo developers, engineers, and navigators. The cost of Apollo missions in total $24. NASA estimated that it had taken more than 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians to accomplish the moon landings, reflecting the vast number of systems and subsystems needed to stand man there. From 3 separate rocket stages built by Boeing, North American Aviation, and McDonnell Douglas, built by the Grumman Corporation and North American Aviation again, around 5.5 million parts were manufactured for each mission, often by a host of subcontractors working for these main Apollo companies.
So our presentation is all about this. Thank you for listening. Our presentation is all about this. Thank you for listening. Your mic is muted.
Okay. So we go on screen share. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Lance Belderol, and I'll be presenting the side of why we never landed on the moon. So, Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I, Lance Belderol, will be delivering the point of error, the fact that we never landed on the moon. I will address the factors that we knew about that fact from the beginning, and the real plan was never to go there in the first place. I've developed 6 main points that prove we did not land on the moon. So the 6 main reasons why we didn't land on the moon are these right below. First, the reason to go there was political. It was a slogan, not a destination. Second, excessive budget and cost overruns required nothing less than success. Third, we could not take off from the moon or Earth with the lander. Fourth, so much of the evidence is faked, and there are different claims to many of them. And fifth, we never went through the Van Allen radiation belts. And finally, sixth, our technology did not exist to do so in the year 1969. So going into the first point, the project was a slogan and not a destination. As you can see, I have visited the museum myself, and I am here touching the moon rock in the photo. So now let's go into the first point, the history of doubt in which the people who do not believe. So let's go into these very specific dates here. In 1969, some skeptical opinions were voiced at the time. In 1974, Bill Casing, in which he presented We Never Went to the Moon. So now we go into 1978, in which Capricorn 1 is a movie about Mars. In 1992, Ralph Green, in which he made NASA Moon America. In 1997, James Collier, Was It Only a Paper Moon? Essentially what we have here is multiple examples of people questioning the validity of us going to the moon in the first place. And as you can see, it stemmed from the very beginning, from the very creation of the fact that we went to the moon. That was just another cover-up, I believe. That's where these people believe. So now in the beginning, there was one country who led the race, in which it would be the USSR. So what we have here is a rare color film of the Nazi V-2 rocket facility, in which it was a top secret World War II German rockets. So if we go from there, Germany built rockets to win the war. So now we have further proof of this. In the end, they lost, and the US and USSR gained scientific knowledge, in which they have the Operation Paperclip, the makings of a space program. I'm not going to show these videos in full length to have time constraints, essentially, so you could watch them later on your own leisure. So again, we have more proof videos of the US military using German rockets after World War II. So now early rocket attempts ended up many times in failure, as you can see from the many examples here in the video, and then came a Russian success, the Sputnik 1957, of which they actually launched into space. As you can see here, they made a special report on TV in the CBS News. So the Sputnik terrified Americans because it was the first thing they have seen that technologically advanced. So it changed our educational system in the US, in which we have another video here, the story of the Sputnik moment. So the space race begins with that, in which you can see here we have another video or documentary going with how the space race began. So on January 17th, 1961, Eisenhower addresses the nation about the military-industrial complex, and he actually warned us of this very dangerous thing. And even then, in the JFK moon speech on September 12th, 1961 in Houston, Texas, as you can see from your example earlier, we have a video of him saying, "We choose to go to the moon." So we have another speech on November 21st, right before his assassination in 1963, in which he delivers the payroll, and he's talking about the circumstances behind actually going to the moon in the first place. As you can see, a very peculiar date because it was right before his assassination. Keep that in mind for the rest of the presentation. So that's when we actually go into point 2, excessive costs and budget overruns. As you can see, we took many photos of the space of the vehicles in the National Museum. So on September 1963, which there is a White House conversation on the moon, and does this actually get JFK killed? As you can see from the video thumbnail below, he says, "We've got to wrap around in this country a military use for what we're doing and spending in space. If we don't, it does look like a stunt and too much money." This is undoubtedly what could have gotten him killed, or just one of the many reasons of why they wanted him assassinated the day after he gave his speech about it. And we go further into these videos of how they actually justify the US space effort and how much funding they had to go through, in which you can see NASA spent about $23 billion on managed programs from 1961 through the first lunar landing in July 1969. And here we have the many operations they overwent, in which you can see the Mercury operation, the Gemini operation, and especially the Apollo operations. This is all in the museum, and you can see it for yourself if you ever do visit the museum for yourself. And you can see more photos of this happening, in which it actually entails the development of manned spaceflight. So you may ask, why spend too much time on the background? Well, for one, it shows that the government deceived the people from the very beginning. And two, it shows that NASA was a propaganda program of distraction. Three, JFK could have easily been killed by the military-industrial complex for questioning the money being spent on this program. Four, there was a reason why Eisenhower waited to the very end of his presidency to give that speech. Five, the same constraints that existed in the 1940s existed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. And six, until the conclusion of the Apollo program, NASA spent $25 billion. So from 1972 to today, on the shuttle programs, NASA spent $225 billion, a very stark contrast and a very major uprise in the whole overcost. So now we go into the third point. We couldn't take off from the Earth or from the moon for that matter. So before we consider the possibility of landing, let us look at taking off. The lack of a more than 2-second delay in a two-way communications at a distance of 250,000 miles or 400,000 kilometers. This still isn't perfected 45 years later. A very weird thing that's going on here. How could they have perfect communications? So now we go into broadcast cameras back to 1969. I want you to look at these two cameras right here. They look very small for that age, and they look very advanced. So on Stan Lever and the Apollo cameras, the right camera transmitted color broadcast from Apollo 11 command module, while the left camera broadcast the first live video of Apollo 11 astronauts walking on the moon. So again, I want you to keep those cameras in mind. Now look at the next slide. This is a TV broadcast camera here on Earth in 1969. You see something peculiar going on here is because this is a much bigger camera than the one we just saw. Did you notice the size difference in these two cameras? Did you notice how this one could be so small when this is the average advanced camera for news stations at the time? Maybe they withheld technology, or maybe they made a whole setup. So why didn't the USSR go to the moon? As you can see here, we have a Soviet moonshot, and we must ask ourselves that question. Because if we went to the moon, then they surely could have gone to the moon themselves. So now we go into the fourth point. So much of the evidence is faked. As you can see here, the first piece of evidence that's faked. Neil Armstrong ejects from the moon lander before crashing. So let's go further. Not only would the cameras not work, when they did, it proved this. Look at this NASA picture. Was the Earth added? Now look at the computer comparison here, and you can see obviously that that would be an added picture, just a picture added onto the screen, not in actuality from the picture taken itself. So a small background on the moonshots. We need to have these. Now you can see Russia's background here. In 1959, they launched Luna 1. The spacecraft Luna 1 was launched at the moon, but missed by around 3,700 miles and went into orbit between Sun and Mars. Now they launched Luna 2 on September 12, 1959, in which at just past Moscow time on September 14th, it crashed some 240,000 miles away on the moon, not far from the Sea of Tranquility, perhaps a not entirely appropriate location. So Korolev and his people were listening as the signals coming back from the spacecraft suddenly stopped. So the total silence meant that Luna had hit its target, and there was great jubilation in the control room. So this very well means that Russia was winning at the time. But what does this mean for the USA? In 1959, they had nothing. They had no background whatsoever, and they just decided to join the space race for technological advancements. Now, you could make an argument that they caught up very fast, but that doesn't make any sense with all the constrictions and all the things that we had compared to Russia when they already had these achievements in their hand. So Russia calls for investigation of the US space. Let's look at this for a moment. A Russian official in 2015 has cast doubt on the first moon landings and demanded an investigation into what really happened after the original NASA footage of the event disappeared. So Vladimir Markin, a spokesman for the Russian government's investigative committee, says he wants an inquiry after the video from 1969 and a piece of lunar rock which was brought back to Earth went missing. So in an opinion piece in the Russian newspaper Izvestia, Mr. Markin says that such an inquiry is vital to reveal new insights into the historical space journey. So Russia never suggests America has never landed on the moon and calls for an investigation into what really happened. So we already have a country going on this, but let's look at the further pictures I took at the museum. So this is the spacesuit. It's in protective glass because it's getting destroyed. That doesn't make any sense because isn't it supposed to protect the person under it, or did it not protect at all? And it was just a costume in the first place. So the image of Buzz Aldrin and the U.S. flag on the moon is used by the moon landing engineers as evidence that the landing was filmed on Earth because the flag appears to be waving in the breeze, and we all know there's no breeze on the moon. And this is to answer back to the claims you made, in which when astronauts were planting the flagpole, they rotated back and forth to better penetrate the lunar soil. So, of course, the flag waved, and there's no breeze required. The problem in this is that the flag waves at other periods of time when no one has touched it. Obviously, it's not supposed to wave whenever you place the flag. It's supposed to wave whenever you place the flag down, but not when no one is absolutely not touching it at all. So that's a very weird thing going on there. And behind me, you will see Neil Armstrong and the moon lander, but it wasn't real at all. This moon rock wasn't real, and the lander wasn't real. As you can see, I touched the moon rock, however, I could not touch this. I couldn't touch the lander at all, but why? Could it be that it was plastic, tinfoil, and tent poles and could not withstand people touching it? Because it clearly looks that way. It looks like, in all honesty, this looks like an elementary school project, an elementary science project. And this appears to be a 6th grade science project, but it turns out to be the lunar module. It's very weird because since no one can touch it, and since you can see the materials were made out of tinfoil, it very real could be just a fake, just another stand-in. But seeing is believing here. The foil for the radiation. Did they really need the foil for the radiation, or did they just need to make something look believable? As you can see, we have a lot of pictures from the museum, and this is the very same lunar module that landed. So it appears almost as a jungle gym. Again, we are reestablishing this point that this cannot possibly be that advanced piece of technology that they use in the first place. So let's go further. The moon buggy appears much like a dune buggy. Why did they choose that design choice? Why does it look like that in the first place? Maybe because they never shot it at the moon. They never shot this at the moon. They just did it in a studio where it could be easier. And look at the command module instruments, toggle switches. How do you control anything? I mean, obviously they would have learned to control this in the first place, but if you look at the logistics of actual toggle switches, it would have to take an immense amount of time just to turn or just to do anything to do to the ship and the module in the first place. Why would they have toggle switches when they could have opted for something more technologically fitting for this kind of operation? The answer is plain and simple. They just wanted to make something look believable, to make something look very advanced for its time. So you spend a great deal of money, so don't you need a success for that? As you can see, we have 2 videos in which one of them is faking the moon landing, and the other one is the new uncovered documents that proves moon landing is fraud. Again, we will not be showing the videos for time convenience. Sorry about that. And now let's go into the evidences of not going to the moon. So 1, the flag. As you can see here, the flag is waving, and the NASA famous flag picture, there is no wind on the moon. That's our first claim, in which NASA replied, the flag is vibrating in the low gravity because the pole that the flag was set on vibrated it, and this motion was captured by the camera. it's a very low gravity in the first place, but there is no wind. So how can we believe NASA and take its word for it? If we stop right here, then it would appear that NASA was right. But are they going to look at it again at this picture? Maybe NASA wanted you to see the flag on purpose. So here's a hint. The flag isn't the problem here. It isn't the main problem. They just use it as a cover-up. As you can see, more pictures of the flag and of the astronaut. So now look at the flag. The flag shadow is in the opposite direction of all shadows in the picture. This means that there is more than one light source. And addressing your claims, this means that since there are only astronauts on the moon and they had not other source of light than the sun, then they were not on the moon. Now, again, you could see that you could say that the sun was very intensive and that it reflects off the surface. But look again at the picture. Everything else is reflecting on that side, but we have the flag reflecting on the other side. A very weird and directional shadow is cast. So let's look at the footprints. It was NASA's connection that the lunar lander didn't raise up any dust from the surface because the surface was a powdery dust. However, in these pictures, we see that the dust has large footprints perfectly formed to the size of the boot. If NASA was right with the dust, they couldn't be right for this. They will not coexist on the moon. So note the scale of Buzz Aldrin to the other features. Does the astronaut appear to be a little bit small? Let's look into the logistics of his actual height. Let's look closer. I, Lance Belderol, am about 5'10" in this picture, and this display is about 8 feet tall. So the suit is about my height, or in the next picture, not even as tall as the moon buggy antenna. Look at the very drastic size differences. Very peculiar things going on here. They had two different sizes for the moon suits. This just proves even more points as to how much evidence they faked for the moon landing. So watch the Apollo 12 astronaut and the flag. The flag is about 3 foot by 5 foot, and but note the scale to the astronaut. It appears to be the same size or smaller. He's very well directly standing near the flag, but why is he so small in comparison? We have to look at all these measurements. We have to look at all these logistics in order to understand that this was not actually the moon landing that we were so to believe all these years. The front shadows on the flag, the several sources of light, no shadow for the flag or side shadow for the astronaut. So now we look into how these shadows actually contradict in the rest of the evidence. They very well did something wrong here, but they know they did something wrong. They just wanted to cover up with these kind of flawed explanations. As you can see here again, there's no shadow for the flag. How can you justify that unless the sun were directly above the flag? But then that wouldn't make any sense. So let's look at the background on Apollo 11 and our Apollo in the next Apollo. Again, the very weird backgrounds we have going on here. I'm about to explain why. Because how could the background goes the horizon? It's always supposed to be the same place. If they are pictures of different places, when really it should be the same place right here. So the Apollo 11 shadow and the size problems, and notice the size of the flag, notice the distance to the horizon, and notice the shadows. Look at here. It doesn't make any logistical sense for any of these things to have that kind of thing in the picture. It doesn't make any bit of truth since you're trying to dissect this picture in the first place. Very weird things going on, but why would they need to have these in the picture? Again, notice the shadows in both of what is happening. You don't see anything here, but he is very light, very lit up whenever he's in the shadow. This doesn't make any sense. The pictures I've shown before didn't make any sense, so this can't make any sense either. Because how can an astronaut be completely white, be completely lit up from a light source when he is completely underneath a shadow? It just means that they just staged these photos even further. Let's look at these. Now look at this photo. They took these pictures of the very same background. That was their mistake. You can see it's very different here on the ground, but it's you even have the module missing in the first place. So identical backgrounds. Now you see it, and now you don't. It's very weird things going on here. Unless the only way these things can make sense at all, of which NASA released, is because they use it as a cover-up for going to the moon. That's the only way we have the same backgrounds, because we can't possibly have just another area of the moon having the completely same hills and having this crater here. Now you could say that craters hit the moon all the time, but why would the model be missing? Why would these things not compare to the things in the other photo? It just means that they staged it. They could only mean that. So we have multiple uses of sets and backdrops. They probably were too lazy to use a different backdrop in the first place. As you can see from the photo comparison here, it lines up perfectly, and that's when you realize that they actually set this up in the first place. This is a very damning piece of evidence we have here. You can't explain the very lucky way in which they have the same background. You can't explain how they have different sets and different footprints in these two photos, and you can't explain just the thing missing from one of the photos. You could try to, but it just falls flat whenever you realize that it's the same exact background and that it's completely different. It's a completely different surface. So now let's look on the shadows of the moon, and they actually converge. What would this mean if they actually converge? It means that the moon shadows don't lie. A light source that was close, like a studio light, would cast shadows in a 360 radius on Earth. As the light source is far away, all shadows are in line and parallel. So going back to your shadow claim, these moon shadows are dodgy. Why would they be dodgy? Because even if we go with the fact that the moon has a very reflective surface, we would have to go from the fact that it's also very far away. So we can't have possibly these kinds of directional shadows right here. The only thing that would make sense, the only thing that would actually fit into these pictures would be the studio light. As you can see, the parallel shadows from the sun and those parallel shadows from a street light. Very different, but you can see it matches the photo up there. So the shadows is in the wrong direction, or the light is filled in. Again, more pictures and video proof of filled in light, and the shadow is absolutely untouched. And from the Apollo 11 lighting, it's from the wrong direction in the first place. Why would this be here when the sun is facing in that direction? This doesn't explain how it could have reflective surfaces. It just explains that it was completely staged. So Buzz and Neil were obviously on the moon, but who was the third person in the visor of the astronaut? Who was that third person? We can't explain this at all. As you can see, we have three people here. How can we explain that unless they accidentally made that person go on set? But going even further into that same picture, it's busted because there is no spacesuit on the reflection. This is merely a fabricated photo from the whole thing, and this means that this can't possibly be on the moon. Let alone explaining the three astronauts, how can you explain the person not having a moon suit? The silhouette doesn't cover up at all. It doesn't cover up anything, and it just proves that we have fabricated evidence, as I've established from the point. This is all evidence fabricated by NASA. It's all things fabricated from the groups controlling the minds of the people. And even this picture, look at this rock. It makes no sense when you look at the shadows that way because it reflects in that direction. And even here, you can see the outline of the vehicle. It would make sense for all these shadows to go in this direction. But again, we have the common theme of shadows not lining up at all. So where is the landing crater? What are these lights from? And what about the footprints if we only have dust? These are the main questions I have brought up to you. Why do all these weird things happen? NASA will say that the moon has 4 to 6 inches of dust, but then why is this boot here and not any here? They can't explain it with the dust theory that they have because it would be impossible. The moon is covered with 3 to 6 feet of thick, fine cosmic dust, and it took minutes to maneuver the lander. So where is the cloud of dust in the crater it could have created? There's no dust even on the lander's foot. Again, this is impossible. All these things just don't add up. All these things just don't line up at all. So yet we have footprints right next to areas of dust. Again, this wouldn't make any sense. It's clearly impossible. So now we look back at the wind on the moon, which the flag is moving, and we have smoking guides. Again, we won't look at the video for time purposes. And now we look at the light source seen in these pictures. It's obviously artificial lightning. You can't explain these lights in the photo. You can't explain this photo right here, and you can't explain the silhouette that he has, obviously not having an astronaut suit, because if you try and do so, it just falls flat into people trying to believe so much so, when really it's just a cover-up and it's just a conspiracy for the moon landing. So let's look into the fake Apollo moon landing photo, in which it claims to show proof mission was a hoax. in which this video essentially talking about the reflection on the camera taking the photos, and it goes in depth to that. So now let's look at the new Seek magazine of 11th to 19th of 2017, and these are direct quotes from the magazine, in which you can see some sort of, it looks like a man back in the early 70s, long hair, wearing some sort of waistcoat type thing, and a shadow of that figure presumably. So we go further than that. This is starting to make me think, where's this guy's spacesuit? This is just more evidence that people are questioning how the silhouette is possible in the first place, but it only could be possible if that was a person and they mistakenly put a silhouette on the astronaut's reflection. So this is starting to make me think, where's this guy's spacesuit? That's where we should look at. That's where we should start looking at every other piece of evidence. Because if this is the moon, then where does this person stand? It doesn't make any sense that we have more than those people on the moon. It doesn't make any sense that the silhouette doesn't do anything. It doesn't make any sense that the spacesuits were breaking down when really they should have protected the person inside. So the moonwalks and buggy rides were fake too. Again, this is another analysis on the fake moonwalk and buggy ride, in which essentially looks into how it can't possibly be riding that smoothly on the moon in this video. So now we go into the fifth point, the Van Allen belts. This is the radiation belts, and this is the definitions for them. So the Van Allen belts prove that two giant belts of radiation exist, in which you can see here from the photo of the Earth. So the Apollo program is the only one to claim to have sent men through this. So let's look at how they can do that. NASA actually admits that it hasn't gone through the Van Allen belts. So how can this be when very clearly they said they're the ones who sent the men through the Van Allen belts? It doesn't make any sense unless they messed up and they admitted that this is actually just another conspiracy in the US. However, we have a very fragile protection. So the energy distribution of the particles in the inner and outer belt is quite different. Changing our 4 millimeter of aluminum to lead would have only marginal effects in reducing dosage in the inner belt, but it cuts the dosage in the outer belt by a factor of 500. Also, the outer belt is still most intense at low altitudes, in which the spacecraft trajectory can be aimed to minimize radiation exposure in the outer belt. According to NASA, none of the Apollo missions exceeded 1 roentgen of total dosage. So now let's look at the sixth point. The 1960s technology was not good enough. Perhaps the most illogical sense of which this could be staged is the fact that they have very weak technology at the time compared to the things that we have now. Let's look at the control panels. It looks very suspicious in which they have dials and they have switch panels. So now where are the following in this? Where's the steering mechanism? Where's the computer and where's the controls? Obviously you need a steering mechanism, but which one of these dials do so? Which one of these things actually steer the module? You could try and pinpoint the exact things to actually steer it, but it doesn't make any, it doesn't actually help or stand up if you actually try and label everything. Again, there's also no computer, so how are they supposed to connect with everything? How are they supposed to have those connections with space control? So now let's look further into the photos. As you can see, the command module, again, this is the exact same picture from the ones I have taken and from the ones previously shown. There is no computer. How do you drive, and how can this be possible if only we have to ask these questions? The question should be asked is, why do we believe we landed on the moon? Let's look at this. 1, NASA told us we did. 2, we saw the pictures that NASA gave us. And 3, we saw live pictures from NASA from the moon. 4, we saw the rocket blast off from NASA. 5, NASA scientists worked hard. And 6, NASA told us the radiation belts were smaller than. So the key here is NASA, and NASA is our government. Surely we can trust our government, can't we? Now look at each statement in the next line. Look at NASA in each statement. What makes each true is NASA. That means they're the defining factor for what makes this true or what makes this not true in the first place. NASA has a vested interest in making the US believe in the first place. So in 1969, we couldn't get TV signals from around the world, let alone from the moon. In 1966, the computer was 3 stories tall. Today, our cell phones are more powerful than that computer. So how can that be unless this was their explanation for just a cover-up? NASA computers at the Johnson Space Center in 1969. As you can see here, very real photos of the computer, of which this is all less powerful than the phones we have today. This doesn't make any sense. How can we have all of these computers driving home the fact that we landed on the moon? And how come we still can't land the moon today and we have to wait for a few years for that to happen again? If computers were needed to get off the Earth, then why is it so weak at the time? That's why the guidance computers were developed, to make sure they got the timing just right, says Doug Millard, in which the term computer only barely applies to NASA's primitive processing technology. So Pillinger says the only calculator available to scientists at the time was the size of a cash register. This further supports the fact that they just had very weak technology at the time, and the fact that we can't go to moon with all our superior technology just means that there is more of a conspiracy going on, or just more of a peculiar thing happening here. How could they get so lucky? And yet, for all these years, we've not been so lucky ourselves, but have all this technology before us. Even a simple USB stick or Wi-Fi router is more powerful, let alone an iPhone. All these things would be more powerful than those computers. So my question to you is this. If we landed on the moon in July 1969 with less computing power than our cell phone we have today, why do we, 1, get lost today using our global positioning system? And 2, can or can we not go to the moon today? And 3, why do we have to wait 12 years before we have the technology to do so if we truly went there almost 60 years ago? It doesn't make any sense, and things don't add up when you think about the technology, when you think about the fake evidence, and when you think about everything that's lining up to this. So Apollo 11 was landed on the moon using a computer that had 1,300 times less processing power than iPhone 5s. That's a fact we have to look at here. And all computing power was on the ground here on Earth. So you can see photos of each computer doing something significant for the moon landing, when really this was just a stage photo too. Everything was staged and the picture was too. The moon buggy looks like a dune buggy and not fit for anything on the moon at all, as you can see from the picture here. And the moon lander looks like an elementary school project, elementary school science project again. It doesn't make any sense how this could withstand the forces of space, how this could withstand the forces of the moon, or let alone the radiation though. It doesn't make any logistical sense how this could come back in one piece but still look like that. So the fact that we are approaching 50 years from the first moon mission, and if we started back today, we could have a man on the moon in about 10 years. What does this sound like? What does this sound like to you? What does this sound like for everyone? It sounds like Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. If that was truly the case, then how come we couldn't do it today if we've done it so many years ago? And did NASA say we landed on the moon 6 times from this period of time? So NASA would have us believe that they could. So the first satellite in orbit was Sputnik 1. The first living creature to enter orbit was Sputnik 2, and the first to return safely living creature from orbit was 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, 40 mice, and 2 rats. So we have all these things going on when really this isn't their track record. It's the USSR's track record, not ours. So they couldn't have gone to the moon by using another country's technology when this was a race for superior technological advancement. Why would they use these examples when they needed to use their own examples? It doesn't make any sense because this was all the USSR's work and they never made it to the moon. So how could we make it to the moon based off of these? So now I have one final question today to complete my argument. If we landed on the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972, why will it take us another 10 years of hard work to land on the moon again? Why wasn't that the same 10 years they used to develop the program in the first place? If there are no further questions, I will resign and let the presentation by Mr. Fetzer. That's the end of my presentation. Going to, right.
Mike, I'm commenting on the two presentations, am I not?
Yes.
I think that it was a great challenge for the Turkish group to defend the moon landing when there's a superabundance of evidence that we did not go. They did a commendable job of recounting the official narrative, but there's a profound methodological difference involved here between confirming an hypothesis and testing the hypothesis by attempting to falsify that hypothesis. We can refer to this difference as the confirmationalist versus the falsificationist methodology. Those who here in the United States are described as conspiracy theorists are actually applying the methodology of falsificationism that was originally introduced by the great British philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper, who made the point that in testing scientific hypotheses and theories, the only evidence that ought to count in favor of those hypotheses or theories are unsuccessful attempts to falsify the hypothesis. And if you attempt to falsify the hypothesis and you're unsuccessful in doing so, then that ought to count as evidence in support of the hypothesis, though it may be that you simply haven't figured out how to falsify the hypothesis as yet. A crucial aspect of this involves assessing the authenticity of the evidence. We have, for example, a multiplicity of cases from the JFK assassination, which you have reviewed in the past yourself, Lance, including, for example, when we look at the photographs behind you, the so-called backyard photographs, it turns out the figure has a block chin, whereas Lee Oswald had a tapered chin, which makes it very difficult to see how it would have been possible for Lee to have been the figure in the photographs, since one person at the same time can't have both a block chin and a square chin. Many of your points, I think, exemplify the difference between three kinds of impossibility. One is logical impossibility, which actually involves even the case I just described of having both a square and a block chin at the same time, like having an object that's both round and square at the same time. Those are things that cannot be true as a matter of logic, or strictly speaking, in the second instance, because of the human figure. I mean, if we had adaptable skull features, for example, then perhaps at one moment we could have a square chin and also a block chin, but not at another. More telling are the physical impossibilities that precluded our making a trip to the moon. Where, for example, you cite the Van Allen radiation belt. Clearly, if living things cannot pass through the Van Allen radiation belt, it would have been impossible for living things, manned missions, to have made it to the moon. Moreover, of course, the claim by NASA that the Van Allen belt was smaller than is preposterous. I mean, the Van Allen radiation belt appears to have occurred when Earth was created about 4.5 billion years ago, and therefore that won't work. You have also made excellent points about our technological limitations, which might fall in the category of historical impossibility. There are at least three varieties here. We actually didn't have the propulsion capability to escape low Earth orbit. Second, we didn't have the computing capability to navigate. And third, we didn't have the communication capability. During the one exchange I had, it was actually, interestingly, on the Huffington Post, when they published a piece claiming that in one single tweet, all of the skeptics about the moon landing had been defeated. The tweet merely said that anyone who thinks we didn't go to the moon needs to have their head examined, which of course is not only not a successful refutation, but commits an elementary fallacy because it's merely on the order of an ad hominem and doesn't provide any evidence whatever. Where I offered courses in critical thinking for 35 years, explaining the difference between arguments that are valid or proper and those that are fallacious and irrelevant, of which that's a classic example. But I used that occasion to post one after another proof that we had not gone to the moon, very, very like your presentation in a much more limited context, because I only had 6 or maybe 8 opportunities. But the most interesting comment that came from the outside was a fellow who said he'd been in communications in 1969-70. And in that era, in order to broadcast, I mean, and we're just even talking about radio broadcast, you would have required a vehicle the size of a bread truck. And of course, we're talking about vast differences, just as you observed. So that, that was preposterous. When it comes to computing power, you're making a devastating point about the insignificance, and the command and control panel is an absurdity. I did a program with Dennis Camino, who used to be the top electronics troubleshooter for the Navy before he went to work for Raytheon. And Dennis made the point that the computer the government has advanced, just the design, we don't see the computer itself, is not even a functional computer. And the fact is, the state of computing science at the time was completely elementary. There was no basis for having navigated our way to the moon. And therefore, the 3 most general obstacles or problems we have is, it was violating the laws of physics because we couldn't navigate the Van Allen radiation belt. We didn't have the technical competence to make the trip because we lacked the propulsion power. We couldn't have navigated our way because we lacked the computing power. We couldn't have communicated back because we didn't have the communications capability. And then in addition, to add on, you went through one example after another where the evidence that NASA has adduced is clearly fabricated or fake. Now, this takes us back to the case of JFK, for example, where the many witnesses, and there are well over 20, who observed JFK's brains being blown out the back of his head, was rejected by the government on the grounds that the autopsy x-rays, which normally would be regarded as the best evidence, did not show it. And therefore, the claim was made that the witnesses in the heat of the moment and their excitement and anxiety must have misperceived or misremembered what they saw, which was difficult to refute, however implausible it may have appeared, until David W. Mantic, MD, PhD, he has both a PhD in physics from Wisconsin and MD from Michigan, and he's board certified in radiation oncology, which is a treatment of cancer using X-ray therapy, which makes him an expert in the interpretation of X-rays. In late 1992, entered the National Archives for the first time with the permission of the Kennedy family, in particular Burke Marshall, then on the law school faculty at Yale, who is the family attorney, to study the autopsy materials. In applying a simple technique from physics known as optical densitometry, which enables you to determine the relative density of the object whose exposure to radiation created the image on the radiation plate, he was able to determine that there was an area at the back of the head in the lateral cranial x-ray that had been patched by material that was far too dense to be human bone, that just happened to correspond to the descriptions we had from the physicians at Parkland of the approximate dimensions of the blowout, and where I would eventually discover that in frame 374, and now it turns out other frames as well, you can actually see the blowout in the present version of the Zapruder film that we have available, where we know now that the government fabricated evidence. In fact, our most recent discoveries include even that autopsy photographs published in what poses as an authoritative source, Robert Groden's The Killing of a President, are not even photographs of the body of JFK. And of course, as you and your colleagues have so well demonstrated in the past, the backyard photographs are not photographs of JFK. We've even been able to establish the body double who stood in for him, who turns out to be Roscoe White, a police officer for the Dallas Police who also was working for the CIA. We see the Mannlicher Carcano in the background behind you. And Jack White, who was a brilliant student at JFK, discovered that there were 3 different Mannlicher Carcanos that were presented as the assassination weapon. Notice there you have a nice case of a logical impossibility, because talking about the assassination weapon implies there's one and only one. So it's not logically possible that there could be 3, and yet the government has advanced 3 different versions. When you turn to physical impossibility, although the government claims that JFK was killed by the impact of high-velocity bullets, the Mannlicher Carcano is a medium to low-velocity weapon and therefore cannot possibly have fired them. And of course, so that's another illustration of a physical impossibility. And when it gets to, historical, Lee Oswald, for example, cannot have been at 2 places at the same time when he was at the Texas Theater already buying popcorn from Butch Burroughs. He cannot have simultaneously been shooting Officer J.D. Tippett a quarter mile away. So, the JFK case, I think, gives us a strong precedent for looking at the moon landing, where we have just a vast array of evidence of many different kinds, of which you have, in my opinion, given a very appropriate sample. And therefore, I do believe that the Turkish students did the best they could with the evidence at their disposal, which are primarily governmental reports. When you look at the evidence, it's impossible to conclude that we really went to the moon for all of the reasons you have advanced. And where I thought that your original research in going to the Space Museum was simply brilliant, right on the mark, where you have made many, many points, and most certainly when you do a close-up of the moon lander, your points are impeccable. It looks like an elementary school science project. Look at the wires. Look at the connections between key components. That thing couldn't resist being dropped on the ground from 30 feet. It would have fallen apart. It was makeshift. It was scissors, paste, scotch tape, and string. I mean, this is an absurdity. And it does appear to have been made out of tinfoil. The fact that the spacesuits are disintegrating under ordinary exposure right here on Earth shows they could not possibly have withstood the trip to the moon. The image problems, the relative size were very astute points. You made some that I've not encountered before, and therefore I can congratulate you, Lance. I thought you did a very comprehensive presentation of how we know that we did not go to the moon. And I also compliment the Turkish student in doing the best they could with what they had to work with, which, alas, it turns out to be was not a very much. I recommend for those who want to pursue this further, a couple of suitable places to begin would be, for example, with the documentary Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon? Which I first encountered during a visit to London, where I was staying at the Morgan Hotel on Bloomsbury Street, which backs onto the British Museum, with my wife. We turned on the BBC, and on one of the channels they were playing that particular video, which gives one scientific proof after another of how we know we didn't land on the moon, including when you slow down the moon buggy footage. It turns out to resemble ordinary speed in an ordinary location, and that you even have the astronauts on occasion being elevated by wires that are connected to their spacesuits and so forth. And it just got me hooked on the overwhelming likelihood that we had, in fact, not gone to the moon. Let me just say one further point. From the point of view of scientific reasoning, what you are doing implicitly is applying the 4 steps or stages appropriate thereto, the first of which is puzzlement. You have some phenomenon, evidence, or occurrence that doesn't fit in with our background knowledge, understanding, or belief, and therefore poses a challenge to understand. Second, speculation. What is the full range of alternative hypotheses that might explain it? Where, of course, here we're confronted with basically 2, namely that we really did go to the moon, and number 2, that we actually faked it. Where the third stage, adaptation, becomes crucial, where you apply the hypotheses to the available evidence to determine on which hypothesis, if it were true, would we confer a higher probability upon the available evidence. If the hypothesis that we really did go to the moon were true, then none of the problems we've been adducing here that you have so ably presented would make any sense at all. They'd have approximately 0 probability. There might be a few where you might want to make an argument, such as in the case of the flag waving phenomenon. But as you properly observed, for instance, where the flag is fluttering in the breeze, there's no one in the vicinity, there's no available alternative explanation than that it was from a source of an air current that you would not have found on the atmosphere absent moon. So, you know, alternatively, if we had faked it, then the probability of the kinds of evidence you adduce, the flimsiness, the spacesuits, the impossibility, the moon lander, the communication lack of ability, and so forth, all turn out to have very high probabilities. So if you assume that one hypothesis is preferable to another, when it confers a higher probability upon the evidence, which is known technically as its likelihood. If you assume that one hypothesis is preferable to another when it has a higher likelihood on the basis of the available evidence, then you're entitled to accept when the evidence has settled down in all points basically in the same direction, as is the case here, as you have so ably displayed. Then you're entitled to accept that hypothesis as true, as the explanation for the data, but in the tentative and fallible fashion of science, which means that even though you're accepting the hypothesis as true, you remain open-minded to the possibility that with the availability of new alternative hypotheses or new evidence, you may have to revise your conclusion, to reject hypotheses you previously accepted, accept hypotheses you previously rejected, and leave others in suspense, and that you don't claim that even though it's the best supported hypothesis which you accept, that it is therefore guaranteed to be true, because when it comes to scientific, empirical, and historical research, no finding is guaranteed to be true. It's all properly understood, tentative, and fallible. And what we have found is case after case after case, vis-a-vis the moon landing in particular, that the evidence overwhelmingly supports that we did not go to the moon and falsifies the hypothesis that we went to the moon. And I thought you did a really masterful job making some points that I myself had not encountered, vis-a-vis, for example, the reflection in the space suit of the other astronaut. And you notice there's a figure in the foreground that's not even wearing a space suit. There's a fellow named Ralph Rennie who's done a brilliant job of analyzing many of the photographs that NASA has presented, who makes the additional point, who took the photograph? Because, I mean, this is a photograph right at the space mask, right at the face of the astronaut. And you're seeing the reflection of another astronaut in the distance. So we must have had at least a third party, and yet by hypothesis, according to NASA, there were only 2 there. One more falsification, And I would just say that there's a brilliant film out there called Capricorn 1 about an attempt to travel to Mars. And the fact is that NASA knew we couldn't go to Mars, that there were problems with their equipment, that the astronauts would have died during the trip. So instead, they kidnapped the astronauts. Well, they induced them to go to a location out in the desert where they actually faked the whole thing on a set and attempt to convey the impression that they'd actually gone to the moon by using a single television feed of a very grainy image to make it extremely difficult in order to sort out what actually happened. And that could be viewed as a prototype here as to what in fact took place. There were problems about not being able to go to the moon, including, of course, the Van Allen radiation belt. But where I must add that there are several recent confirmations that we did not go to the moon. One being, and this you mentioned in passing, that NASA itself has acknowledged that the principal obstacle to a manned mission to Mars is the Van Allen radiation belt, where if that's the case today, obviously it was a problem in 1969, 70, and so forth, indeed for the entire history of Earth. Second, that they have offered a $30,000 reward for assistance in solving what they call their space poop problem, which is that currently NASA only has the ability to deal with human excrement up to about 14 hours using space diapers. But of course, that's preposterous because these trips to the moon took a week or more. That means the entire space program is nothing but a gigantic pile of space poop. And as though we needed further confirmation, there was a massive collection of space footage from the lunar landings that would have been, had this been authentic, the priceless footage of man's greatest adventure as a technological and scientific achievement, which NASA destroyed. And of course, just as one of your studies showed that the moon had been added to a photograph, that it wasn't part of the original, they were destroying the footage because a minute dissection would have demonstrated that it was all a complete fantasy, it was all fabricated, it was all fake. Once again, going back to test the authenticity of the evidence becomes crucial, because once you've done that, sorted out the authentic from the inauthentic, whether it's the case of JFK, for example, or the case of the moon landing, it becomes relatively unproblematic to determine which hypothesis, if it were true, confers a higher probability on the available authentic evidence, and therefore it has the higher likelihood, it is the preferable hypothesis where, as you have so ably demonstrated, the evidence has indeed settled down, and we're able to accept the hypothesis that, alas, we did not go to the moon, and where the explanation with which you began of the political motivation provide a perfect understanding, where NASA has benefited from probably $1 trillion by now. You were talking about billions in money and value and currency in that era, which is, of course, greatly appreciated now. NASA, on my understanding, is technically a branch of the CIA, so that we find out that, the deception is a part and parcel of their mainstream activities. Let me just close by observing, well done to the Turkish group, but you were dealt a bad hand. You did what you could playing it. Congratulations to Lance for a completely brilliant presentation that covered very, very many aspects here. And let me just add, virtually every point that Lance made is devastating and proof in and of itself that we did not go to the moon. There's a principle under the law known as fraud vitiates everything, where in a legal context, if you can find any component of the material aspect of the case that has been fraudulent, fabricated, or faked, you're entitled to dismiss the entire case. Here, with regard to the moon landing, if we call those sufficient conditions for rejecting the moon landing, meaning in and of themselves they proved we did not go, you must have presented as many as 100 sufficient conditions for proof that we did not go. So I want to commend you once again for your work here, as in the case of JFK, Lance. Well done.
Fencer, I was going to ask you a question real quick. If Capricorn 1 is to the moon, do you think it's the same as 5 Days of May is to JFK?
Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I think, in fact, Oliver Stone's film, JFK, is very close to the mark as to what really happened at Dealey Plaza that day. It's the most accurate, complete, and comprehensive presentation ever made to the public through the mass media. It's faulty in 3 respects. He posits 3 hit teams. I have determined there were at least 6, and it's possible there was many as 1 or 2 more. Second, he assumed that the Zapruder film was authentic. We know it's been massively edited and revised, in fact, by my most recent calculations. Well, the original film has 487 frames. The original had around 1,000. They took off about 100 frames at 18.5 frames per second, turning from Houston on to Maine, because the driver, William Greer, swung out too widely, nearly hit a concrete abutment, had to pause, hesitate, get back in line. That would have shaken the public's confidence in the Secret Service ability to protect the president, for which, of course, we have at least 15 indications of their role in setting him up for the hit. And then after the driver pulled the limousine to the left into a halt to make sure JFK would be killed after bullets began to be firing, a great deal of activity took place during that interval, including that Officer Hargis, who was riding to the left rear and was impacted by the debris from the shot that blew Jack's brains out to the left rear with such force he initially thought he himself had been shot, parked his bike, ran between the 2 limousines toward the grassy knoll from which he believed the shots had been fired. Officer Jackson on the other side motored his bike up the grassy knoll until it fell over, proceeded on foot. 5 officers exited the Secret Service vehicle and surrounded the presidential. One picked up a chunk of skull from a little boy and threw it in the back seat. Meanwhile, Clint Hill was rushing up to push Jackie back into the seat. All of this took, by my estimate, although I thought originally the stop was only a few seconds, as much as 20. So there's another 400 frames. So the original had as many as 1,000, but we're left with a massively edited version that was produced by the CIA in a photo lab adjacent to Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York, known as Hawkeye Works. And third, Oliver Stone did not know that Lee Oswald was actually standing in the doorway watching the motorcade as it passed by. I believe, by the way, that these misunderstandings on his part were because he was using as an advisor Robert Groden, who is, of course, the author of the book, The Killing of a President, where we have the autopsy photographs that are not of the body of JFK, where Groden has played a crucial role even as an advisor to the House Select Committee on Assassinations when it reinvestigated the case of attempting to debunk the claim that Oswald was in the doorway, and where Groden, to this day, maintains that the Zapruder film, which he, together with Dick Gregory, was the first to bring to the public's attention on a Geraldo Rivera's show in 1975, is authentic, in spite of a massive quantity of evidence to the contrary. So just Groden, you might say, was playing a role vis-a-vis JFK that NASA is playing vis-a-vis the moon landing. They're both maintaining a myth, attempting to prop it up by suppressing authentic evidence on the one hand and advancing fabricated evidence on the other. It's a dismaying legacy for the American public once they come to grips with the realities of the situation we confront in both instances. And of course, today we know there are many, many more.
Thank you very much for the comments, Mr. Fetzer, and thank you to the Turkey School for presenting your side of the arguments.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask a question. Lance has been doing a lot of research towards flat Earth. You're interested in that too, correct?
Well, you know, I have a degree in the history and the philosophy of science, and the history of science is dominated by the history of physics and astronomy. I mean, man has been studying the stars since ancient times. In fact, since they're at such great distance and have fixed relative locations, I have no doubt that this is the reason why when the astronauts committed the blunder by saying that on the surface of the moon the sky was black, they've sought to stick with it. We have the Russian cosmonauts reporting, you know, the superabundance of cold, clear stars in the heavens. They should have seen billions of stars, none of which would have been twinkling, of course, because that's an effect of the atmosphere here. But because, you know, they have fixed locations, and therefore if they showed the stars, it would have been easy to have done a mapping to have shown that they were not on moon. They just couldn't pull it off. So they went with a subterfuge, which is completely indefensible, that the heavens were black from the surface of moon, one more gigantic tell. Now, when it comes to the flat Earth issue, yes, I mean, not to anticipate, but if you were going to do a program on that, I would be glad to assist, but I have addressed this in a number of contexts. I mean, classic physics explains the difference between day and night, to wit that the Earth is an oblate spheroid, meaning it's like a globe but slightly thicker in the middle, that its circumference is approximately 24,000 miles, that the Earth is rotating on its axis at the rate at the equator of about 1,000 miles an hour, which divides our day into 24 one-hour segments. Because of its rotation, we have the distinction between day and night, because the moon is circling the Earth in approximately every 28 to 29 days. We have the definition of the months, but we have leap years to make adjustments because Earth is rotating around the sun and taking an annual orbit known as a year, but the year is actually defined by the amount of time it takes Earth to rotate around the sun. We have the differences in the weather because of the inclination of Earth on its tilt, and when it's closer to the sun, we have summer. When it's further away, we have winter. All of these classic observations have been substantiated by, you know, generations of research. We've worked our way from the flat Earth model to a spherical Earth model. From the view that Earth is a motionless center of the universe to Earth as a rotating object where the sun is the center. We get the progression from the Ptolemaic model of the universe to the Copernican. Then we get the advances by Tycho Brahe's naked eye observations, the most perceptive in history. Kepler's work to discover that the orbit isn't perfectly circular, but rather elliptical. Newton's synthesis, using his laws of motion, in particular the inverse square law of gravitation. Then Einstein's refinement with the special and general theories of relativity. I have challenged flat earthers to even specify for me the dimensions of Earth on their model in terms of its length, its breadth, and its depth, because this is a puzzling phenomenon. You know, how do you have a flat Earth? Of course, it's possible they could claim it's of a spherical shape and therefore attempt to explain away the shadows cast on the moon when the sun is opposite the Earth and the Earth's shadow is being cast on the moon and they're circular shadows. But they have a greater difficulty explaining why the mass of ships disappear as they head out to sea. Why, if you're in a tall building looking at to sea with a straight edge like a ruler, you can actually see that the ocean is higher in the middle. And if you're a pilot, you can perceive Earth's curvature. Of course, they want to deny space satellite photographs of Earth, much less, you know, having been taken from the moon, on the ground that NASA is lying to us. And of course, that's an impeccable point. NASA is lying to us. But the fact is, That doesn't mean that everything that NASA says is a lie, and most certainly the fact that Earth is a spherical object, like every other object with which we're familiar in space, where we have in Jupiter, for example, a miniature model of Jupiter with its planet circling. It's very difficult for flat earthers to offer a defense, and I have asked whether they maintain, how they explain how Earth, the flat Earth, maintains its position in space. There's an old story here about the Earth being supported on the back of an elephant. And when was asked about and the elephant on the back of a giant tortoise, and the tortoise, and the joke goes, no, from there it's turtles all the way down. But you can see the indefensibility of the flat Earth model from the beginning, so that, it's to me very peculiar that this has emerged now. I must suggest, I believe this is a CIA-sponsored PSYOP, and it's to confound those who are doing objective scientific research with a puzzle that science has resolved over thousands of years of research in astronomy and physics, as a diversion and to split some sincere people who believe in, for example, the Bible as a literal source of truth. And while I do not believe you can find a literal description of a flat Earth, they have interpreted the Bible as supporting the view that Earth is flat, so that you'll find some of the publications by those who support a flat Earth ultimately appeal to the Word of God, which from a philosophical point of view, as one who has addressed the question of whether or not we can prove the existence of God in courses throughout his entire career, we know that it's not, there are two modes of proof, deductive and inductive, which includes scientific. Deductive reasoning makes explicit the contents of premises. That's all it can do. So that if you have the content of a conclusion of a deductive argument, it's merely recapitulating part or all of the content of the premises. So that deductively, unless you assume the existence of God as a premise, which is known as begging the question by taking for granted what you want to establish on independent grounds, you cannot have a proof of the existence of God that is sound. That means it's not only valid reasoning where the conclusion cannot be false if the premises are true, but that also has true premises, which, of course, since the argument is valid, guarantees the conclusion must also be true without begging the question. So a deductive proof is out of the question here. When it turns to inductive, we're talking about processes or procedures, observational, empirical, involving experimentation and measurement, that are restricted to the contents of space-time. Since the traditional conception of God is transcendent and outside of space-time, it's beyond the capability of scientific or empirical reasoning to detect evidence for or against the existence of God. I therefore submit that if you are a person who is committed to, for example, what is known as the ethics of belief, advanced by the British philosopher William Clifford, which maintained that everywhere and always you're never entitled to believe anything for which you lack sufficient evidence, then you're in a quandary, because just as the arguments I've described cannot prove the existence of God, the arguments I've described cannot prove the non-existence of God either, which means the only rational position that's in accordance with the ethics of belief is to suspend belief and to neither believe in the existence of God nor to believe in the non-existence of God, but to remain an agnostic. In the case of the assassination of JFK or the moon landings, however, we have ample evidence at our disposal where once you sort out the authentic from the inauthentic, it's possible to prove that JFK was not killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, but rather by a conspiracy that was of a fairly elaborate form, and where the efforts that were taken to cover it up implicate not only the government of the United States, but the American military and the Secret Service and ultimately the President of the United States, who forced himself on the ticket in Dallas in 1960 in order to set up for taking out JFK. So that Lance was historically mistaken in believing it was JFK's announcement about the moon program. No, frankly, it had to do with his desire to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces, that he hadn't invaded Cuba, contrary to the unanimous recommendation of the Joint Chiefs, that he'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, contrary to their unanimous opposition, that he was not going to remain in Vietnam, where it required a stand be taken. The mafia wanted him out because Bobby was cracking down on organized crime, bringing more indictments and convictions than ever before in history. The Eastern establishment surrounding the Fed wanted him out because he'd had the Department of Treasury print United States notes on the ground that it was absurd for the government to be paying interest to a consortium of private banks to print the currency of the United States. Israel wanted him out because he was at loggerheads with David Ben-Gurion, who wanted Israel to develop nuclear weapons, which Jack thought would initiate a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And the Texas oilmen wanted Jack out because he was going to cut the oil depletion allowance, which was a huge tax write-off they got on the ground that they were putting themselves out of business because oil was a finite resource, which was, of course, a bit of a stretch, but it worked politically. But ultimately, the reason for his assassination was Lyndon Baines Johnson's insatiable desire to become president of the United States. He was absolutely ruthless, had no scruples. He would not brook any opposition, where we even know that he sent his chief administrative assistant, Cliff Carter, down to Dallas to make sure all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. The moon landing turns out to have been an enormous political hoax. Lance has done a really excellent job of surveying most of its dimensions. There are many, many more proofs that, had we time and opportunity, I would present to supplement what Lance has already shown, many of which overlap with points he's made from a slightly different point of view. I mean, the evidence is just stunning. And as in the case of JFK, with regard to the moon landing, we find that new evidence turns up that further corroborates the hypothesis to which we've been led, that we did not go to the moon, just as further evidence turns out to corroborate the hypothesis to which we've been led, that JFK was not killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, but by a very extensive conspiracy.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I'd like to say thank you, Mr. Fetzer, for your explanations on this matter. And I'd also like to say thank you to the Turkey School for defending the fact we did go to moon. So I'd like to conclude and see you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.